Hi folks, welcome to Create with Copper. As I post this, tomorrow, October 15th, is Sew Saturday. This celebrates bricks and mortar sewing shops. As a devoted crafter, I've spent many hours in sewing shops, fabric shops and haberdashers. So in celebration of this, today we're making this patchwork pendant. The materials you need for this project are copper sheet. I'm using 0.6mm thick, but you could use thicker. 40cm of 0.4mm diameter wire, some jump rings, a chain and clasp. And the tools you need are a ruler, a permanent marker, a centre punch, a hammer and block, a drill, a hole punch, chain nose pliers and wire cutters, a jeweller's saw, files and polishing tools, some small dapping punches, and I'm going to be using liver of sulphur. Now this project is about precision. Try to make everything as accurate as possible. It doesn't have to be perfect, but being off early on could mount up as you progress through the project. So the first thing to do is decide on the measurements. I decided I wanted to make my pendant from a square and a rectangle with this grid pattern of holes. I wanted there to be 5mm between each of the holes and 4mm at the edges. So I cut and filed a 23mm square and a 23 by 28mm rectangle. Now I need to mark where the holes are going to be on the copper. So the first thing I'm going to do is put my ruler right at the edge and mark 4mm in on either side. And do that on all four edges. I can now line the right ruler up with those marks. So I'm 4mm in from the edge and mark on where my holes will be at 4mm, 9mm, 14 and 19mm. Once I've done that for all four edges, I've got the grid for the holes. I'm then ready to start making the holes, so the first thing I'm going to do is use a centre punch. This creates a little divot in the metal which stops the drill skidding around. Again, be careful to place them as accurately as you can, and then just give them a blow or a couple of blows with the hammer. And work round each of the marks to create all of the centre punch divots. Now that's the last one done, so I'm ready to start drilling. Now I've had some problems with drilling. I think it's because I've got an old drill. But one of the things, if you are having some difficulty, you could try lubricating the copper where you're drilling. I'm just using a bit of machine oil, sewing machine oil. It seemed to be in keeping with the project. And you just want to take the drill in as vertically as possible and drill your holes. If you have problems like I have, just take the drill out and then go back in again. And take your time. Now that's the first hole done. So I'll just crack on with these and I'll be back with you in a bit. Now I've drilled all my holes, but as you can see there are burrs on the underside of the metal where the metal is just pushed through with the drilling. So I'm just going to file those off. And I find the piece of scrap wood that I've used for drilling the holes is really helpful in holding on to the piece for this. Just take any of your files and just file those burrs down till it's smooth on the back. Okay, so I've now got my square patch. All the holes are drilled. I've filed the burrs off of the back and cleaned it up a bit. I've also got the rectangle that I've made in the same fashion. The only difference with the rectangle is that I've got a little bit of texture that I put onto the piece just to differentiate it. And I haven't drilled the holes where that will be behind the square patch. Now I'm going to solder these just to give it a bit of extra strength, but you don't have to. If you weren't going to do that, you need to basically make the holes where the square stitching will go through onto the back, onto the rectangle. So you'll just need to use a pen and make those marks through those holes and drill those holes. But I'm going to solder these together and then I'll be back with you. Now I've successfully soldered my pieces, so I can now drill through using the hole on the front on the square as a guide to take it through the back rectangle. And then once cleaned up, the piece will be ready for stitching. So my piece is now cleaned and polished and almost ready for stitching. But there's one thing I need to tackle first. The holes I've made are basically big enough to take the stitching. I should have said before the drill bit I used was 1.2mm. But because I want to use a couple of the holes to hang the piece on the chain, the two corners that I want to do that with need to be slightly larger. So I'm going to enlarge those using my hole punch, which is 1.5mm. So they don't need to be a whole lot bigger, just a little bit bigger. I find this will help me just position those holes. What I'm trying to do is get them so the extension is kind of outwards from the hole. The inner corner is in line with all of the other holes that I've made. So take your time to line it up and then just screw down on the hole punch to make that hole. You might find, because there's a hole previously there, you end up with this weird sort of long burr, but that just needs chopping off and then filing down. Do the other corner in the same manner. And then we're ready for the next stage. Now the holes are currently totally flat, which is absolutely fine, but I just want to give a bit of an impression that the thread's pulling down on the fabric, so I'm going to round them off a little bit. And for that I'm going to use my smallest dapping punch. Just place it over one of the drill holes and hit it once with the hammer. Move round till all the holes are done. For the two larger holes that I've just made in the corners, I'm using the next size up with my dapping punch. So we're finally ready to start sewing, and you need to take your 0.4mm wire and just fold it in half. Now I said 40 centimetres of this, it's a bit of an estimate and you should have some spare at that, but it depends on how big your piece is. Just take your wire through the last hole in the bottom of the rectangle, just so the centre of the wire is going through that hole, and press that flat, and then with one end thread it down through the next hole, and with the other end thread that up through the next hole. Make sure all of that is pulled tight and is lying quite flat to the piece. And then take the end of the wires through the hole in the same manner the next hole, and continue sewing that way around the rectangle. Now I don't want my stitching over the edge of the square, so once we reach the edge of the rectangle, the top stitch can go down through the last hole, but I don't want the bottom wire to go up through that hole, so just going to move that wire out of the way and then skip a stitch and go straight down into the nearest hole in the square patch. And then with the other wire, I'm going to help hold that in by crossing it over and taking it diagonally to the adjacent hole. If that is a little bit raised up, you can always flatten it a little bit with your flat nose or chain nose pliers. We've then got half of the next stitch started, so we'll take that first wire down through the corner hole and continue stitching around the square in the same way as before. Once you've done all the stitching, you need to finish off the ends of the wire. I'm sure there are several ways you could do this, but I'm just going to wrap them around one of the stitches on the back. So have a think about which stitch would be best and neatest to finish the wire under. And if the stitch is quite tight, you might just need to lift it a little bit. Thread the wire through and wind it around that base stitch 3 times. Once I've done the same with the other wire, I just want to make sure those wraps are nice and tight. And if they're sitting a little bit raised up, you can push them down gently with the edge of your pliers. Once you've checked everything's fine, just cut off those ends as close as possible. Now I'm just going to bend this very gently, just with my fingers, just so it's got a very gentle curve on it. Might sit a little bit better on the neckline. And that's the pendant done. Now I've added a bit of patina to the piece just to bring out the texture in those stitches. Now's the time just to put everything together. So I've got a chain. I've already made an S-clasp before that's attached, and I just need a couple of jump rings. Now I want to chop the chain in the front middle. So we've got two halves going up either side. Then I'm going to take one of the jump rings, carefully thread it through one of those holes in the corner that we punched earlier. Then pop on the chain. Do the same for the other side. And that completes the patchwork pendant. Don't forget to head out and support your local fabric shop. If you like this video, please press the like button below, subscribe to my channel and head over to my blog for more hints, tips and projects. Thanks for watching. See you next time.